Good afternoon. I've been standing in the back for most of the day, as you all probably have seen, which I much prefer to do, and I realize these lights are very bright. So I do want to thank you personally for spending the day with us. We have a final panel here for you today before final remarks. And so I get the pleasure of asking some of the leaders of our industry some questions about the future. So I'd like to welcome them to the stage. Again, Chief Tanya Heitman from Santa Barbara, Chief Jennifer Branning from Lassen, and I was like, who's next? Chief Richard, as you all know, and Chief Keene from San Mateo. So one of the things we tried very hard to do throughout the the planning of this day is to try to capture 10 years worth of wonderful work, but also to try to set the stage of a little bit about what it was like prior to 678. Oftentimes, it's so easy to forget why certain change was made. So we tried to have a little bit of the historical perspective, and then obviously spend a majority of the time talking about what has been accomplished in the past 10 years. And all of that's important, but it's so important to have it documented before you start deciding now what's next. What is the future hold, or what should it hold? Because if we're not informed by the past, what's that saying? You're doomed to make the same mistakes. And so thankfully, I think we've done a wonderful job in trying to play that story forward, and had a lot of different voices before you kind of talking a little bit about it. So now switching gears to what the future holds. Our speakers today also kind of laid out a few things for us to be considering, a few things to build upon from the 678 experience. And I think the first question I would have for Chief Heitman was, as it relates to the governor, spoke about a lot of things today, actually, quite a few things as it relates to our business, but specifically he talked about what we can be doing with front-loading services and supervision and moving our industry even further to a risk-based model, and not just simply basing everything on offense-based. So with that in mind, do you have a few thoughts about that?
Well, obviously, very excited about the proposal. It was great to hear from the governor today. Very inspiring words that really, I think, speaks to the hard work that we've done to raise our industry to the level that it would be recognized by the governor as being such a foundation to support criminal justice reform going forward. I believe that his framework that he put out in his budget proposal really builds upon the good work of 678, that we now can definitively say that if probation has sufficient resources, they can take the research that's out there and improve the criminal justice system in amazing ways. We heard that from practitioners today, we heard that from researchers, and we heard that from our clients themselves, that it really did make a difference, that what we believed could happen if we had the resources came to fruition. And the governor's proposal allows us to expand that. In Santa Barbara County in particular, we have been supervising some misdemeanors for quite some time, and it's really been a disparate system. The irony is that we're funded for treatment and services under 678 for felons. We're funded under AB 109 for those returning to the community after serving their sentence in prison or in county jail. But our misdemeanors, we didn't have any base of resources to build treatment services for them, and this offers us opportunity to do that. It would mean that our offenders that are misdemeanors won't have to say, but it's not fair, I can't get that service. You're telling me I'd have to commit a felony, I'd have to go to prison in order to be eligible for those services? It didn't make sense. So now through this opportunity, we'll be able to do that. We'll be able to continue to use the risk assessments to make sure that the resources are directed to the right clients and that they're getting the services that their needs assessment indicate would most impact their lives. But on top of that, the stabilization of the 678 funding, as we're here to celebrate all that's been accomplished through 678, is enormous as well, to know that that's going to be not fluctuate so dramatically from year to year. 678 was an experiment, and I think that we would all agree it was a success, and now we have the opportunity to do that for misdemeanors. Of course, we're going to, it is a proposal at this point, and we'll be working with the governor's office and the legislature to fine-tune it, but very optimistic about what it means for the future of probation.
Thank you. One of the other things that the governor had brought up, and we obviously have been involved in even prior to his tenure, is just how to manage pretrial services, pretrial reform in our communities. And there's been a lot of looking at that, whether it's through various case law or legislation that's passed. But, pretrial reform is clearly going to be perhaps the next frontier of our work and how to affect our communities in a safe and efficient way. Can you talk a little bit more, Chief Keene, about pretrial reform and what your county is doing specifically and what you kind of see on the horizon for us as a state?
Well, thank you very much for that, Karen. I think one of the most important parts about the pretrial conversation, we have to keep in mind that regardless of what happens in November, the idea of bail has been fundamentally changed in this state. And so there's no going back. So we can't just look to it and say that, well, we can kind of hold our breath and wait for that to happen and then make a decision at that point. San Mateo County was very fortunate enough to be one of the chosen pilot programs. We had I think a decent pretrial system beforehand, but we really look at this as an opportunity to enhance the services that we currently provide. When I think about the future of where we go, I really see this as a continuation of the success that we have shown in terms of what probation can do when it's been properly funded. I do know there's a lot of conversation out there, obviously, around the use of risk assessments or risk tools. I was very impressed this morning that the Chief Justice made such a definitive statement about her support of pretrial assessments and what that means for us moving forward. And I think what CPOC and all the chiefs have demonstrated is that when there's research that's been demonstrated or presented to us that something can be done better or something can be improved upon, we lean into that. As far as we know at this point, there is no research that has fundamentally clearly demonstrated that risk tools are bad. We'll just keep it simple as that. I think that there's a lot of, I would say, probably disconnected noise in the background about what that looks like. But what I'm really excited for is the opportunity to really lean in and find out if there are better ways to do it. I think whether it's through SB 36 or other initiatives that talk about the importance of data and data collection to really demonstrate the importance of what we do, CPOC is right there at the cutting edge of that conversation. So I'm really looking forward to the future because I think it gives us an opportunity to further demonstrate the success that we are able to have with proper funding and really relying on evidence-based practices and really data-driven decision-making.
Great, thank you. And you did touch on risk assessments, which also seemed to be a topic of conversation today. And I know we even had heard from the Chief Justice regarding risk assessments. We had a little bit of a moment to talk to her before she took the stage, where she, shared some thoughts about that as well. And it's been so critical and integral to our work in probation at various levels. I'm wondering, Chief Richard, can you share a little bit of your thoughts about just risk assessment and the debate that's kind of unfolding before us?
Yeah, actually, so, I've got a bit of a unique history in the world of risk assessments, and besides the work that I've done in government, I've been across the country establishing risk assessments as the basis under which a number of departments have done their work. And what we've found universally is that a department utilizing a risk-based system with an analytical risk tool attached to it were far more successful in identifying those people that really needed services versus those people that didn't. Taking out that gut level assessment of, yeah, I know this guy, I've seen this guy before, this is the type of guy that I need to supervise, versus, well, maybe it is and maybe it isn't. Let's take an actuarial look at whether or not this is a person that we should be investing our limited resources in. That, by and large, and to a state, from Texas to Florida to California, we've seen nothing but improvement when risk assessments are utilized. So Chief Keen touched on it. I'm going to maybe put a finer point on it. If risk assessments are not the way for us to proceed, show me the way that we should. Because right now, I see nothing else out there that is the right way of proceeding when it comes to identifying who is a high-risk person to recidivate versus a low-risk person to recidivate. So yeah, the challenge is out there for us to continue to grow, to continue to refine, to continue to get smarter. And we should. The governor said it today. Mark Leno said it earlier today, that we should be continually improving our systems. And that is, I think, well, one, in California, the probation system, that's a mantra of ours. We want to continue to lead the change and be better and be smarter at what we do. If somebody comes along and says, yeah, we spent the better part of the last 2 decades talking about the efficacy of risk assessments, and we were wrong, but here's how we could improve the system in a different way, we'll be the first group to pick up the mantle and run with that, whatever that is. But so far, I haven't seen it, I haven't heard it, and I'd be on the lookout for it. So, so I would say bring us some more information.
Great, thank you. You know, I know it probably gets old. We lobby here all the time, the state, for more resources, but I have to say, we've always said, you know, if we're invested in, if probation is invested in, we can help bring about change. Obviously, 678, I think, makes an excellent case for that. But it was really heartening to hear the governor even speak to the need for that investment, the need for those resources, and the need for those resources in rural counties, for example. I mean, I don't know if you recall a governor ever saying anything like that before, so that was very heartening to hear. But the truth of the matter be told, and Chief Branding, I was hoping you could share some of your thoughts on this. It's not just resources, right? I mean, there's a lot of other things and challenges at times that we need to think about, and opportunities, you know, to overcome some of those challenges that are unique to the rural story.
Thank you, Karen. There is a lot of challenges and a lot of barriers in rural counties and small counties. We don't have access to a lot of services. I'm not one to focus on the negative. I would rather really focus on the positive. So I've changed my way of thinking, and I've asked other northern chiefs and small county chiefs to change their way of thinking and say, well, what do we need? Maybe we can ask for training dollars so that we can train our staff. Since our staff wear multiple hats, and it's very difficult to get training for some of our staff, and our training budgets usually get cut in some of the smaller areas. If we ask for training dollars, we can get our staff some training, and we would be able to provide the services, the programs, and build our own resources within our departments. And that's been one of the biggest pieces for a lot of us in the rural counties, is being able to have that infrastructure to move forward. If we had training and implementation dollars, we would be able to build and borrow some of the tools that we need in order to shorten that time to actual implementation, because it takes so long. When you have chiefs and you have staff that are working 2 and 3 positions at a time, sometimes it's really difficult to stop and focus on, okay, now I got to write this policy really quick. And you want something to have very careful consideration. And when you can use some of those training or implementation dollars to be able to have some of those tools pre-built and a toolkit to choose from that you can actually just change and make it your own. That's really important for us. And I think engagement with our clients, being able to know that your lifelong friend or somebody that you've gone to high school with, graduated high school, that level of engagement is a little bit different because you know so much about that person. When they come in, it's often very difficult to get over some of those barriers. So I would say that we would want to really focus on some engagement with a lot of our clients in those areas where we know them and we're friends with them. Being able to really, have those resources available for flexibility, within each county, it's very different. Our populations are different. The challenges that we face are different. Flexible funding, it was nice to hear that that's part of the governor's proposal and, something that people are really thinking about. I know that, having that ability to pool funding and bring trainings more regionalized, sometimes in the north, is very important to us as well. So all of those considerations and hearing those in some of the proposals and knowing that we can, instead of focusing on the negative part of a lack of resources, we can focus on a positive piece and say, hey, here's what we need in order to make this work in our smaller counties. So.
Thank you. I'll put a little bit of a curveball in because we have a little bit of extra time to do this, but I'm pretty sure Chief Keen will be ready and willing to hit this one out of the park. The issue that we've talked a lot about is educating folks about what we can do in probation, what we are doing in probation, who we really are. And, today was kind of a nice day to be able to do some of that. And I think you've heard from many speakers to that effect. I didn't know what probation was, could do. I mean, we even heard from a client that I thought just hit the nail on the head when, they shared how, they were in another state and what that probation system looked like and how it was different here. And we battle a lot of that in media, in the legislature, sometimes in understanding how it works here in California, probation specifically, and what we've done. And so some of these stories at a national level don't necessarily fit the California story. So, so did I tee up some of your frustration on this topic well enough?
You did, and I feel like I owe Brock a dinner. I don't know if he's still here, talking about his Tennessee experience. So, I've been very fortunate to really have an opportunity to live in three very distinctive regions in the United States. I was born and raised in Chicago. I spent a significant amount of my early professional career in the state of Louisiana, and then had the opportunity to move to California, but then also the unique subculture that is the Bay Area. And so this idea of what probation is and what it's not, as Karen knows, has been a significant source of frustration for me. I think that it's very important to look to national conversations around the state of probation or just community corrections. Let's call it that for now. I think that's incredibly important because it can inform conversations. It can certainly bring to light things that we may not necessarily specifically focus on because I think as what's been highlighted here, continuous improvement is what California probation is all about. And so I want to start to say this phrase more frequently now, California probation. One of my significant frustrations has been that a lot of the national conversations around what's wrong with probation really oftentimes centers around stories and issues that are not California specific. And many of the advocates and many of the people we partner with in a lot of areas around the work that we do oftentimes latch on to these very broad stories about, the misuse of probation and how probation is just a money grab and how we don't do any services for the people we serve or that our juvenile halls are mini jails. And these are conversations that may have an air of truth in another state, but not here. And so when, for example, a few years ago, and the conversation started around fines and fees, I promise you that pretty much every time this conversation came up, Karen and her team had to tie me down to prevent me from exploding every time someone talked about it, because they would use these analogies about how probation would charge them and they were losing homes and people were having liens placed on their homes and things like that. Well, yeah, that's true in Tennessee, or that's true in Florida where probation is privatized, or that's true in maybe a state where probation is run by some weird, city-level entity that actually are not peace officers. And so when people use this term probation broadly, it does California probation a disservice. the work that we've done over the last 25 years to not only be innovative, but quite frankly, to be responsive of the needs of our clients, and I think we've heard a lot about that here today, I would question and put us up against anyone and say that it's unmatched. Now, where this becomes problematic is in the city we're in right now, when a lot of these national stories catch wind and a staffer or maybe someone who is situated to have a legislator's ear kind of comes to them and says, hey, this is a problem. And you think about the conversation around how we treated our children in the hall, and this idea of separation versus solitary confinement. That's one of the very kind of broad terms gets utilized. The folks here oftentimes listen to those stories. And so it's really incumbent upon us as a profession to distinguish ourselves from some of these national stories. And that really starts with you and your jurisdictions. When your elected officials come to Sacramento to talk about the work that you're doing, it's important that you educate them in every opportunity and every turn you get. Because those national stories are not our story. Those are not California probation stories. And so I appreciate Karen giving me an opportunity to rant on this, and I'm trying to keep it under wraps because I really, really want to jump on top of the table. But with that said, though, in all seriousness, I think that it's really critically important that as a lot of these initiatives start to come through, we be bold and step out and say, that is not us. Now, as any chief will tell you, you never say what you don't do or what we don't do on our county, because we never know. But there's certain things about the way we do this work and the quality of our staff and the intention of our staff. That's a message that should come every single time we get in front of people who have a voice and people who will listen to us. And the last thing I say is I'll tell people all the time, my advocacy may not look like yours, but I am an advocate for children nonetheless. I may not approach it the way you approach it, but please don't say that I don't care what happens to the people we serve.
Well said. Finally, I would just want to throw this question out to all four of you for comment. When we think about what the kind of future holds, we've talked about a couple of very specific issues. Obviously, we started talking about specifically what 678 is all about. We've now talked about specific proposals that are floating in the legislature or before the voters today. But really what strikes me is that a journey probation has been on probably for its entirety, but really seems to be at the forefront now is really redefining safety, redefining, community safety and how you achieve that and what that means. And so it does seem as though this could be a moment in which we can talk about that and have a platform in which to do so and how probation plays a role in that. So hopefully that was amorphous enough for you all to pick something to talk about related to that, but it really seems like there's so many things that connect to it. I'd be curious to hear.
Well, I'll jump in and just say that, I think it's an interesting question because the community defines safety in specific ways about how it impacts them. Crime victims define it a little bit differently sometimes. The legislature, law enforcement partners, they all have their own definition of what safety is. And I think for me, the challenge sometimes is our own staff of really helping them define safety in a meaningful way and understand their role in it, and that it's really about changing people and changing behaviors. And it's not about, the gun or locking people up or ensuring that a crime doesn't happen because we're never going to be completely successful at eliminating all crimes, but we can be successful at impacting safety by being willing to disrupt that cycle and intervene. And we are the experts at assessing and mitigating risk. And many of our partner law enforcement agencies don't get that there is significant value to mitigating that risk and allowing people to remain in the community and be engaged with their families, and that can be a more powerful way of ensuring long-term public safety.
I think I would be, I'm most excited for the future with being able to serve the higher risk populations. We see them all the time in our communities. We see them all the time within our homeless population. We see them all the time with some of the reoffending. And I'm really excited to be able to start looking at providing some of the services to that population. It feels like that's the population that people get, in our communities, get the most frustrated with. They get shunned the most, and I think that it would be really awesome to have that ability and the funding and the resources to provide services to high-risk people on pretrial and high-risk misdemeanants, to add those to our population that we serve. I think it'll do our communities really good.
I think building on something that Chief Heitman alluded to is the idea of safety as much as we think about the community, but also the way in which we define safety for our staff. I think is really critically important. I think that, as Chief Heitman stated, oftentimes our staff are very cognizant of these tools, whether it's a gun or a taser or a vest or certain types of kind of mechanical things that they kind of add to their tool belt. And they sometimes erroneously equate that with making them more safe and therefore improving their ability to work with clients. And I would take it a step further and say, the time that I think I felt the most safe as a probation officer is what I alluded to this morning. It was when I had something to offer a high-risk client, when I had a program to offer him or her, when I actually had the ability to kind of put my words into action and to demonstrate the interconnectedness with him building a relationship with me and his success. And so this idea that somehow these other things are going to make you safer, really we want to, I think, redefine that for our staff and help them understand that the idea of building rapport will help keep you safe. The idea that if you invest in this person and this relationship, it will improve community safety because, quite frankly, you're helping to stem intergenerational issues. As I said, you're planting those seeds for later. You're helping the offender today, which will help their child later, which furthers the opportunity to keep your community safe. And so, while I think we will certainly find ways to make sure that the victims' voices are heard in this conversation, I think that we will always work collaboratively with our law enforcement partners and the legislators about their larger concerns around what safety means to the public as a whole. But I think until we really continue to improve this conversation amongst our staff at all levels, that there will always be this misperception somehow that things other than me will make me safe. So I just think it's this broader conversation, Karen.
So imagine, if you will, that my floating crystal ball is on top of this little disc here. And because everything in politics is cyclical and swings on a pendulum, I can see a day in the not-too-distant future where, to capitalize on a theme that's been discussed by my colleagues, the pendulum is going to swing back, and people are going to start screaming from the tops of the mountain saying, what about the victims? You've been focusing so long on the offenders that you've forgotten about the victims as an industry. And I think we have to be incredibly careful of that, because we are, by every measure, as important to the victim community as any piece of the criminal justice system, and here's why. Because what you do, what we do collectively, is to honor victims and to care for victims by preventing victims. So I tell this little story that sort of brings the point home, that if at 3 o'clock in the morning I've got a guy who's trying to kick in my front door, I want a sheriff's deputy there in 2 minutes or less. What I'd really prefer is that that guy had a quality, well-trained, caring probation officer preventing him from being on my doorstep at 3 o'clock in the morning in the first place, so that I didn't need the sheriff's deputy to come protect me. Because that's what we do. We prevent victimization, we prevent future criminality if we do our jobs right. If we're well-resourced, well-trained, well-educated, we can prevent those types of crimes in the future. but we've got to keep the victims in our conversation. And I think it's really easy not to lose sight of the victims, but to miss the opportunity to talk about the victims and how important they are to us and how important they are from the perspective of we don't want to see any more of them. We want to see fewer of them. And we can help criminal desistance and crime avoidance, and that's what we do. That's what we're trained to do. And I think we need to bring that into our vernacular more. I think we need to bring that into our culture more. And I think we need to remember that we are representing the victims at all times in the processes that we go through and the things we do professionally. Because if we don't, I think it's eventually going to come back and bite us from behind because we don't talk about it enough.
You know, it's funny you say that because I think oftentimes we've allowed the district attorneys to suck all the air out of that space because they're very quick in most of our counties to take ownership over that land and say that they're the ones that are there for the victims. But the last time I checked, no DA has written a restitution report. The last time I checked, no DA has had to deal with a victim who is complaining that the probationer is not paying their fair share of what was promised to them. And so I think Brian's theme about really making sure that these things are, you know, we realize they're our space is really critically important for the future.
Thank you for sharing that. I mean, it just really brings home that balance is a key part of the work that probation does. And I will just end by saying my favorite statement, and there were a lot of them made today, that is just ringing in my head, which is something you said this morning, Chief Richard, is we're guardians without gates. And that really seemed to capture in one phrase what I understand you all do on a day-to-day basis. And it's not easy, and you know, it often comes with danger, but it's an important role that hopefully ends cycles of violence and reoffending in our communities. So I'm very proud to be able to be a part of that.